Welcome and thank you for joining our second Insider Tips webinar on the historical argument and thesis statement. My name is Vania Boland and I'm the state coordinator for the National History Day in Iowa program. A couple things tonight before we get started. You are muted and cameras are off. So if you have any questions or comments, or you're looking for additional suggestions or advice on things we're talking about tonight, please submit those into the chat box. I am reviewing those throughout the presentation, and Andrew and I will take a look at those and answer your questions throughout the presentation. The next Insider Tips we have is next week, October 27th at 4:30. We're going to talk about building the project. So please make sure if you've got time to join us. Otherwise, these webinars will be recorded and posted onto our website. So tonight we're going to discuss the historical argument. We're going to talk about what it is, why it's important to your project, and then we're going to dive into the thesis statement. So we will talk about the information that should be included in your thesis statement and how to make a strong thesis statement that makes your project stand out. And I would like to introduce my colleague, Andrew. Andrew, can you introduce yourself and share some background?
You bet. Hi, my name is Andrew Klumpp, and I am the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society. The Annals of Iowa is our quarterly history journal, so we publish history by scholars who are working on Iowa history here at the State Historical Society. I grew up in Sanborn, Iowa, which was in far northwest Iowa, over in O'Brien County, if you know where that is. And I went to school at Northwestern College and then did a master's at Duke University before finishing my PhD at Southern Methodist University. And ever since then, I've been here at the State Historical Society. So I've been here for a couple of years now. And so that's a little bit about what I do and where I come from. And I'm really glad to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's great to have you with us. And I'm actually going to let you take it over and talk about our main subject tonight, the historical argument.
Yeah, so we're going to jump in on historical argument. And as I mentioned, I am an editor. I edit the historical journals. I work every day with authors who are using and developing historical arguments. And so we just wanted to start this conversation by discussing what is a historical argument, especially as we're thinking with students and trying to help our students do that well. Some basic things are the historical argument is going to be what states your central point or the focus of your project. And so that means that as a reader, I've been a judge for National History Day in the past. When I read your thesis or your historical argument, I should know exactly what you're going to talk about. What's your central point? What's your main focus? Historians will then create these arguments by analyzing evidence from the past. So this is where your research comes in. As your students or you are working with that research, that's when you're developing what will be your argument. And the argument and the evidence are so closely tied together. One of the things as a judge that I've seen happen in the past is you'll have someone who has a really great argument, but the evidence supports something else or isn't tied directly to it, or has a really great evidence, but the thesis or the argument is a little bit different. So what you want to do is make sure that the argument that's being developed is really closely tied to the evidence that supports it. It may seem really obvious in some cases. Oh, well, this evidence proves my point. And if so, that's great. It's good when there are clear, direct connections. That's the hope. More evidence is almost always a good thing. So that is a little bit about what a historical argument is. And then there are some components of a historical argument that we'll also want to talk about. So what does that look like? So in your historical argument, you're going to want to answer what happened, who was there, the 5 W's. And Vania will talk about that a little bit later. And you'll want to kind of give a sense of the sequence of events. And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later, because with the historical argument, you have both the statement itself, but then how you kind of support and deploy it, right? So you'll want to give a sense in your historical argument of what time period you're talking about. Be specific, help your readers or your judges know exactly what it is that you're working with. You also want to know about the evidence. So your evidence really needs to support your argument. How do you know the answers? How do you know that this is how it should be interpreted? And then 3 and 4 are related, but you want to ask the question of impact, short-term, long-term. What changed because of the topic that you're looking at? How did society respond? Was it positive or negative? As it relates to the theme, Did your topic spark dark debate? Did it lead to diplomacy? What's going on here, right? Why does it matter? And that also is tied with significance, right? So the big question is, so what? Why should we care about these people or events? That's what this is. And that's an important thing too. History should not just, or National History Day projects shouldn't just be interesting, but they should also help people understand why they're important. And that so what question is such a key part of that. These are the four main parts of a historical argument that will be deployed. You'll have your thesis, but then you want to make sure that you're engaging all of these things throughout your project. And I want to mention now what that looks like from an organizational standpoint. And this is something I tell to my authors, the people I work with every day, and I have told to my students in the past when I was teaching, is that a historical argument is a little bit like a recipe, right? You need all the parts to make it work, but you don't need them all in equal amounts. And you sometimes need to include them in a particular order, right? So the thesis, your thesis statement, which we'll talk about at the beginning in a little bit, actually just in a moment, your thesis statement is where it's going to come up front, right? That's where you start. I was making a cake this weekend, and I started with the butter, right? You start with the thesis statement. Historians like you to be as clear and concrete as possible. They don't mind if you put it up front. This is what my conclusion is. This is my argument, right? And then you want to have a lot of evidence, right? Lots and lots and lots of evidence. This is going to be the bulk of the project, right? I've worked with a lot of papers. If you have one paragraph that has that introduction and the thesis, you'll have several paragraphs of evidence. That is where you're really building your claim. You're showing your readers how you know what you know. And that is often going to follow a chronology, right? Historians, as a group, I speak as someone who identifies as a historian. We like to think about things in order. We like to work chronologically, so moving through a timeline. So you'll want to follow a chronology of your main event. What happened first? What happened second? So you'll be deploying your evidence while also helping your reader understand what happened. If you are working with things that aren't in chronological order, you'll want to make sure that the reader understands that and why you've chosen to do that. There are some good reasons to, and there might be some projects where that would work a little bit better. And we'll talk about that next week in our webinar. But keep in mind that historians like to think chronologically. And if you want to do something other than that, just help us follow along with you. And then lastly is the impact and significance. This is, I like to think about it like baking powder or baking soda, right? It gives the lift. It helps things grow. When I'm baking, it helps things rise, but you just need a little bit. So that's going to be something that often comes at the very end of your paper. And it says, this is really important because of X, Y, and Z. This is how it was impacted later because of X, Y, and Z. And it's all the more powerful because hopefully you've stated your argument. And with all your evidence, you've convinced whoever is engaging with your project why you're right. And then they're able to see not only why you're right, but why what you had to say is really important. So it's even more powerful. It's so important to have each of these elements, but as you're organizing them through your projects, you want to make sure you have them in the right amounts. And if you're working especially in a paper, you want to try to have them in an order that is easy to follow. And even if you're not working in a paper, you want to make sure everything is easy to follow. And we've got lots of evidence. And so that's just a little bit about organizing that kind of historical argument. And those are just some of the basics. We're going to pause here for a moment now that we've kind of talked through some of these definitions and guidelines and just see if there are any questions as it relates to some of these, as it relates to the historical argument.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very clear. I like the cake analogy. That's a great idea.
I always like an excuse to think about cake.
Absolutely. It's important. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions. So we'll probably just go ahead and move forward. But if anyone does have questions, feel free to submit those. And we're going to come back to another slide for questions. So I will be reviewing those. All right, so what is a thesis statement? So a National History Day thesis statement offers a concise summary of the main point or claim of your project. So in other words, you're not just introducing your topic, but you are creating an argument that expresses your topic's significance in history and demonstrates how the theme plays a central part. So what I like to say is it's short, it's sweet, and it's to the point. With all projects, the thesis statement is one of the first things that judges look for. So it's important not to leave the thesis statement to the last minute. That's a big thing. Don't procrastinate on your thesis statement. It's best to start writing while you're in the middle of the research process. That's usually what we recommend. After you have reviewed a couple sources, start drafting a couple sentences of your thesis statement. So that way, the statement is based on knowledge, but still has a chance to be flexible. So I'd recommend, once again, having 5, 6, 7 sources before you start writing that thesis statement. Give yourself some context. It helps direct students through their argument, and later, during the contest, when the project is ready to be evaluated, it helps judges through the project's ultimate point. So as a former judge myself, when I approached projects to review, the thesis statement was the first thing I looked for because it was going to explain to me what I was about to learn. This is a very important part of your project, but for a lot of students, it can be pretty daunting or overwhelming. But I want you to remember the thesis statement is your opportunity to set boundaries of the topic as well. So you're telling people what you're going to focus on, but also what you will not be focusing on. So tonight, I would love to break this down, and I want to go over some steps and some strategies on how to build this. But first, I want to turn it back over to Andrew to talk about going from a research question to the thesis. So Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think that this is a great way to kind of think about things as we're moving toward the thesis statement. And often that first step is changing the question that motivated your work into an actual thesis or an argument, right? And we talked a little bit about research questions in our previous webinar, which you could check out as well. But oftentimes, historical research is best when it's driven by a question. Somebody's asking, "Why did this happen? What did this do?" And so there is that process of taking the answer to your question and turning it into a thesis. And the way I want to think about this, or I thought might be helpful, is just to give an example, right? So maybe when I was working on my project, I wanted to know the answer to the question of why Terry Branstad was appointed the ambassador to China in 2016. Like why was the governor of Iowa chosen? Well, and in my research, maybe I found out that he had known the president of China, President Xi, since the 80s when Branstad was governor and Xi was a vice president in China. Okay, well, now that I found that, I might decide, well, I want to argue then, or I want to make my historical argument be that the 1980s were a significant moment for developing diplomatic ties between Iowa and China because of the connection between two leaders. And then that would become my argument, and I would move forward, right? What that's done is it said, here's the answer to my question. The answer was, oh, they've known each other since the 80s. And then the question is, well, how does that become an argument? Oh, well, I want to say that the 80s were important for this diplomatic moment. Does that make some sense? So what we're doing is we're taking our answer and reframing slightly to make that argument. This argument would do a few things, right? It goes into the past. We often encourage students to work at least 25 years in the past. So this question about 2016 is a little bit too recent, but the 80s are not. And so you could jump back into the 80s. That's far enough. There has clear significance and impact. This is an international event. It also has clear ties to diplomacy and debate, even to some extent. And there's lots of evidence. There's lots of books that have been written about Iowa in the 80s, and there's good access to records. So it allows you to wield that evidence to your as your answer. So what that's done is it's taken a question and it's changed it into a thesis. And that goes through that process of writing out your answer and then analyzing how can I frame that answer in a way that makes a historical claim. So that's a big first step. And now Vania will talk us through kind of how to fill out that step once you've kind of gotten the framework in place.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. All right, so let's talk about the 5 guidelines. So first, let me say there are no hard or fast rules for thesis statement writing, but I like to follow these 5 guidelines, which I actually learned from the National History Day Minnesota team. So a small shout out to them, and thank you for letting us use their 5 guidelines. Include all the 5 W's. So the thesis is the first thing that the viewer reads. So we should know immediately the who, what, when, where, and why. The historical significance or why this is important. I'm sure many teachers and students have heard me say why many times. Why should we care about this topic? But we want you to prove it. Go beyond the facts. We don't need to see every detail of the topic in the thesis. Leave that for the project itself. But the thesis statement is your argument or claim. In other words, the thesis statement should clearly share the point that you are trying to make in your project. Keep it short. The thesis statement should hover between 40 to 60 words. If it's too short, there's not enough information to explain what the argument is. If it's too long and too many details have been included. So keep your project category in mind. For example, if you're working on an exhibit, you have 500 student composed words to use. So it doesn't make sense to use up 100 of those words just on the thesis. So there's a lot of drafting going on. Include the theme words. Judges need to know how the topic relates to the theme, especially if the topic is not well known, extremely narrow, or isn't immediately clear in its connection to the theme. We're going to write, we're going to revise, we're going to research, and then we're going to revise again. So students should not use the first draft of their thesis, but instead should revise based on feedback, go back to their research or conduct new research to make sure the thesis is accurate, and then revise once more. It sounds exhausting, but that's the big part with History Day. You're editing and you're revising and you're working on your project for months. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have someone else edit your writing. So I just like to put in a note here. I highly recommend asking a teacher or another adult through History Day or even a National History Day and Iowa mentor to take a look at your thesis statement. There is no harm in having someone review that for you and give advice and some feedback. So in addition to the 5 guidelines, I've got some examples. I want to go over what a weak thesis statement looks like to a strong one. So let's start with this first one here. So in 1865, the United States of America won the American Civil War against the Confederate States of America. So first thing, this is very specific. Yes, this information is true, but we're missing a couple things, all right? So let's look at, it's a very narrow topic. The Civil War is a broad topic. This is with any National History Day project. Students need to be addressing a narrow topic. The Civil War is a great place to start, but they need to narrow into something smaller to focus on. Significance. Well, why is it important that the United States of America won the American Civil War? Why is that important? This is pretty broad, but what is the student's focus? What is their argument or their claim? What were they exactly researching about? What was their focus? This statement does not explain what the student believes to be the historical significance or the why is this information important? What impact did them winning this war have? And the theme words. This statement doesn't contain any theme words, nor does it explain how it fits into the theme. So let's take a look at another one. Number 2. In 1865, the United States of America won the American Civil War against the Confederate States of America, making it the most important war in American history. All right, so again, that's a narrow topic. Students need to be addressing a narrow topic. The Civil War is a great place to start, but we want to dive into it a little bit more. We want something more specific. And the significance, where is that? Why is it important that the United States of America won the American Civil War? So the student's argument is instead a personal opinion, and you want to stay away from personal opinions. Your claim needs to be defended by your research. So we're not able to prove that the Civil War is the most important war in American history. That's an opinion. Once again, what were they exactly researching about? What was their focus? So this statement does not explain what the student believes to be the historical significance, and we need to know why it's important to learn about. And where are those theme words? I'm not seeing anything, and I'm not seeing a connection to a theme. All right, let's look at the last week one here. The Battle of Gettysburg was a major turning point of the Civil War and helped the Union Army win the war between the states in 1865. All right, so we have a narrow topic. This student is going to address how the Battle of Gettysburg was a major turning point of the Civil War. They're going to showcase an analysis of how this turning point helped the Union Army win the war in 1865. But what are we missing here? So significance. The student's argument is instead a personal opinion, and you want to stay away from personal opinions. So that claim needs to be able to defend your research. Once again, we're not able to prove that the American Civil War was the most important war. Once again, what were they exactly researching about, or that focus? So the statement doesn't exactly explain what the student believes to be significant, or the why it's important. Why do we learn about it in class? And of course, those theme words. I'm still not seeing those theme words. All right, so let's look at this beautiful thesis statement. This student went through many drafts, and as they continued researching, they developed the following thesis statement. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 was a major triumph for the Union Army during the American Civil War. It turned the tide of the war from the South to the North, pushing back General Lee's army that would never fight again on Northern soil, and brought confidence to the Union Army. So this is relatively strong. We now have a narrow topic. This student is focusing on the Battle of Gettysburg and how it turned the tide of the war and how it was a triumph for the North. The student points out impact, stating it turned the tide of the war from the South to the North. And they share the significance, stating General Lee's army would never fight again on Northern soil. So this brought success or triumph to the Union Army. And the theme for this one was triumph, I think triumph and tragedy. So we see that word triumph, that big theme word, which is brilliant and beautiful and fantastic. And Andrew, I want to turn to you really quickly as the former judge, looking at this strong thesis and some of the weak thesis statements. Is there any suggestions or advice that you would share with teachers and students on when they're drafting that thesis statement?
Yeah, I think the main thing I would point out is just to draw on something you mentioned earlier, which was that this statement does a good job of telling us where the focus will be, and setting clear boundaries. Right. Some of the other thesis statements, for example, they talked about the Civil War more broadly, or things like that. As a judge, I don't know what you're going to talk about, so I might complain, well, you didn't talk about Vicksburg. I think Vicksburg was really important, or you didn't talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg or the burning of Atlanta, right? As a judge, I might have all these other ideas, whereas this strong one really says Gettysburg. So as I read through this particular project or engage with this project, I'm not thinking, well, what about Vicksburg or what about the burning of Atlanta? No, those boundaries have been set. I think this is another example of that, right? In a way that I think is important to draw out. You're going to keep judges focused on what you want them to be focused on, and help me as a judge not bring in a bunch of stuff from my previous knowledge or experience.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about writing that thesis statement. So a couple notes for me. Don't let the thesis statement intimidate you. Writing a thesis statement is a great skill to have, and I'm always impressed at the quality of work I see in NHD thesis statements, so be proud of yourself for taking on this task. And as I mentioned before, don't wait until the last minute. It's important to recognize when you should start working on the thesis statement. So the thesis statement will be easier to develop during the analysis step of your History Day project or your process. So after you've conducted some research, you have an understanding of your topic and your focus, I would suggest looking at least 5 to 8 sources or a mix between primary and secondary before starting the thesis statement. It's difficult to write a good one without doing any research. I want you to keep in mind you're going to be going through several drafts. As you continue to research and craft that analysis, your thesis statement might need updating. Many participants like to call the thesis statement a roadmap of the project. You will need to make sure your thesis statement is in line with the information within your project. Also remember that good writing is clear writing. Don't feel like you need to use a bunch of fancy words to impress the judges. Writing clearly is always more impressive than an extensive vocabulary. All right, I also want to pinpoint, as you research, you might have to make some tough decisions. You're going to be working on this project for months, or you've probably already started, but as you're looking for information, you're going to find lots of fun trivia, some cool facts, that you've never heard before on your topic. So you also need to learn that there's going to be many important facts that will help you shape your project's analysis. It's important to take the time and figure out what information is important to use in my project and what's just a really cool trivia fact. All good writers struggle with wanting to include more information that's necessary because it's interesting, it's fun, or to show what they did the work. But the best writers, that's what the editing process is for. We want to just include the information that's important to supporting our topic and our argument, and remove what's just a cool, interesting fact. So, for example, it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln was the tallest president in the United States or in US history, but for the thesis that we've worked on, it would not be relevant, and reviewers would wonder why it's even there. That has nothing to do with his work towards the Civil War or his presidency. So that's just an example I like to use. But before we move forward with that, Andrew, do you have any advice or suggestions or comments on, while you're researching, pulling important information versus interesting, or maybe some tricks on how to determine if it's just a fun fact or if it's going to help support our argument?
Yeah, I think that I often, when I'm researching and writing, will have kind of, I like to keep a list of things, that I think are interesting, but I'm not sure if they're important, because sometimes you may not know. And it's okay not to know right away if this is just interesting or if it's important. And so I often will keep, a document where I'm keeping track of my notes, where I hold those things. And then later we'll kind of try to make those decisions. Oh, my thesis, as I've revised, means that this isn't really relevant anymore. And I often joke with one of my frequent contributors that the editing process is filled with many tears, because we fall in love with our writing and we fall in love with our information, and so much of it has to be cut out because it isn't relevant. And so if you're sad that you're not including facts, you're joining a very broad company of historians who often have to cut out things that are really interesting but aren't necessarily relevant. A good place, if you've got something super interesting that you just feel like you want to include, is if you're going to tell a quick story or use a really vivid description. That might be a good place to slip something in. You don't want to do too much, but with the Abraham Lincoln example, if you were telling a quick story, right, you say, oh, as Lincoln stood up to give the Gettysburg Address, a towering 6'3", tallest among the presidents, blah, 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 going on, right? It helps us visualize something. It's put in a moment, and you move on to relevant things. You don't want too much of it. But some of that stuff can be used every once in a while as a little bit of color, but just a little bit. Otherwise, again, as a judge, I'll get distracted and wonder why it's there. So just some notes on how to keep track of things. Don't write something off right away. Maybe keep it with you for a while, but be prepared to cut it back. So you just have a little bit to keep us focused on the main argument and topic.
That's great advice. I always hope there's no tears at History Day, but I know some kids in the past that they struggled having to limit on what to include in a project. So I understand that. All right. And so lastly here, we have a worksheet that we share with teachers on how to develop a thesis statement in the classroom. And I wanted to walk through that really quickly, just to kind of reiterate those 5 guidelines and how to piece together your information, the answers to these questions, to creating a thesis statement. So in this worksheet, we are listing out our topic, but our first thing is we're going to answer those 5 W's. So who was involved? Who was affected? What happened and what was the main event? That's the big thing. Where were the places that it took place? So we need location. When did it happen? How long ago of a time period was this? Or how long ago did this event take place? Why did it happen and what caused it? So what was the lead up to your topic? And we want to focus on that when and why. So that historical context. I always talk about taking the judge and kind of throwing them into the time frame of when your topic took place. And why is it important? What were the outcomes of your topic? So historical significance, why is it important? That short-term, long-term impact. All right, and theme connection. So is there a connection to the theme, and how do you share it within your thesis? So try to connect to both of those theme words, debate and diplomacy. I do believe that you're able to select one or the other, but as always with the annual History Day theme, projects that can connect to both theme words, so debate and diplomacy, are going to be much stronger. And a lot of the topics that we've looked at, if you're focusing on one of those words, try to dive in and look at that short-term or long-term impact and see if you can reach the other theme word, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to reach on both. And let me know if you have any questions with your topic if you're unable to reach both of those theme words. All right, and finally, how will you defend your argument? So we need to find a focus. It's not just a fact-finding mission, right? So we want to pull it all together, establish our argument, and we want to explain that we have the information or the evidence to prove it. And once again, this will most likely change as you do research. There will be a lot of editing, a lot of revising. You'll have many, many drafts of your thesis statement. And a couple tips that I've pulled from other students and other teachers is to use strong verbs. Avoid starting your thesis with this, I, or my topic. Look up the definition of the two theme words and use those synonyms in your description or your thesis statement. And compare your thesis to your analysis. So does it match? Like we mentioned earlier, your thesis statement is the roadmap to your project. It needs to be the instructions and share with the judge what they're going to be reading and reviewing. So you want to make sure that it matches. All right, I'm going to take a look at our chat box here and see if we have any questions. And I'm not seeing anything, but Andrew, is there anything else that you'd like to add or any final tips or tricks?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I think the final word I would say for students and teachers is that writing a thesis is always a work in progress. It's always refinement. So don't ever get so really embrace that revision process as a part of the work, and that'll often set you up for a lot of success. So don't be afraid to reach out to me if you have questions or things I can help with. But embrace the process, I guess is what I'd end with.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us again. I appreciate it. All right. Well, if anyone does have any questions, this is my email and my phone number, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. And if you have specific questions that you'd like to ask Andrew, I'm more than happy to forward those to him. As always, you can find more information about the National History Day program at iowaculture.gov/NHD. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and listening to this, or if you're listening to the recording, please let me know if you have any questions. We are here to help you. I know the historical argument about 2 years ago is when National History Day specifically asked students to articulate what their argument was in their process paper and in their thesis statement. So I know this is a relatively new change, and that's why we wanted to put together this webinar. So once again, if you've got any questions or you're struggling to piece that together, please reach out to us. We are here to help you.